there is something we need to talk about.
We begin tonight with another
some breaking news
report on inflation.
Inflation surging to a 41-year high.
A recession is inevitable.
There really is no protection.
We're going to have kind of a tough period.
This thing might even be in your pocket right now. And what I'm referring to is this. It's not just me who thinks that something might be coming. YouTubers, presidents, and the richest man on earth think the same.
As to whether there is a recession in the near term, I think that is more likely than not.
You see, there's something going on here, and there might be a reason to be worried. I think it's important to note that this isn't about inflation. And I'm not trying to say the dollar's going to collapse tomorrow or that there will be a recession next week. What I'm trying to say, though, is that there was a decision made several years ago that eventually will lead to the dollar's collapse. The year is 1944. The world is at war. World War II has been underway for 5 years, and it is slowly wrapping up. D-Day happened 1 month ago, and it was looking as if the Allies finally had the upper hand. It looked as if the Axis powers were being pushed into a tight corner. Despite this newfound confidence in the possible eventual win, the citizens of these Allied countries were tired and exhausted. They had endured one of the toughest portions of American history, with World War I and the Great Depression happening only a short few years ago. Many still had vivid memories of standing in line for food, as money had become very, very tight. And now they were experiencing firsthand the biggest war in modern history. But if we look past the war, we see that there was something else on their minds. What would that be? You see, one of the biggest fears facing citizens back then was the fear that their currency wouldn't be worth anything in the future. To make things worse, there was no guarantee that the economy would survive given all the turmoil it had just gone through. And this fear of the economy collapsing wasn't just in their heads, it was actually happening to Germany and other countries. These photos show how bad it was back then. Kids in Germany played with bundles of money because it had less value than wooden blocks or real toys. That's how bad it was. Wood was more valuable than currency. It sounds fake, right? But it was so real to so many people. But what does this have to do with the current state of the United States dollar? Well, we are getting to that. These people in the government knew how bad this currency fluctuation was and wanted to do something about it. In all, there were delegates from 44 different Allied governments. They gathered in the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and got to work on this issue of currency fluctuation. 14 days later, they scripted up an agreement and titled it the Bretton Woods Agreement. This agreement did two primary things. First, it tied the currencies of these 44 countries to the United States dollar. This was done to hopefully make all the currencies connected so that the fluctuations would be less intense. The second thing it did was it connected the United States dollar to gold. So now following the war, the currencies were stable. Or so everybody thought. But no, they weren't. Fast forward to August 15th, 1971. The United States is in a bit of a financial rut. Inflation was increasing and the currency was no longer steady and sturdy. This man, President Nixon of the United States, had a decision to make. And what was this choice?
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
Now this not only opened up the possibility for price fluctuations of the United States dollar, it also cut the ties between gold and the other 44 currencies, as the United States dollar was no longer attached to anything. And what this means is that they are free floating and not backed by any store of value. Do you see where I'm going with this? Now, just having a fiat currency isn't the end of the world. However, a fiat currency with something else might just be. This is by far the scariest part. Hang on, it gets worse. You see, when the US dollar was cut from gold, it actually cut every single other world currency from gold as well. However, other countries haven't abandoned this agreement like the United States did, and they have tried to keep their currencies within a certain percentage of the US dollar's value. These ties are growing stronger and stronger. The world economy is now dependent on the US dollar to hold value. And this is because the US dollar is what's called the global reserve currency. Now hold on, this next part gets a little bit confusing, so I'm just going to try to explain it the best way I can. What a reserve currency is it's a currency that is used to facilitate international transactions between two countries. I think an example would probably be the best way to communicate this. Say I wanted to buy a baseball from China, but I lived in Canada. Hold on. In order for the baseball to be shipped from China to Canada, payment has to be made. However, China doesn't want my Canadian dollar because they want to be able to use the money in China or other countries. And nobody but Canada primarily uses the Canadian dollar to trade. This is where reserve currency or international currency comes into play. Currently, the United States dollar is a reserve or international currency. It is recognized by the majority of countries for this purpose of international trade. China would happily accept the United States dollar because China knows that it is a very liquid currency. So when I buy my baseball, behind the scenes what is actually happening is the US dollar is used through a US correspondent bank and sent to China for payment rather than my Canadian dollar. Interesting. So the US dollar is actually so important into international trade that there are several commodities that you cannot just buy and sell internationally without actually having to use the US dollar. In fact, if I wanted to buy oil, gold, coffee, or corn, I would almost have to go through the US dollar to buy it. And because of this, almost 50% of the United States dollars are actually held outside of the United States for this purpose of international trade and reserve currency. And this was all fine and dandy and it worked just well until something started happening. Something I'm sure you're all very, very, very familiar with.
Begin tonight with another staggering report on inflation as prices are rising at the fastest pace in 41 years.
Gas prices led the way, up nearly 60%.
Once countries decide that they will no longer use the dollar for reserve currency purposes, there's nowhere else for them to use the dollar, so it'll just be sent right back to the United States. This would create hyperinflation that the United States has simply never seen before. We think inflation is bad right now. This would be 5 to 10 times worse. Millions of unwanted dollars would be flowing right back to the United States, and outside demand for the United States dollar would completely fall, possibly to zero. Because after all, any currency can be used as a reserve currency. Nothing says the United States dollar has to be the only reserve currency. It could be gold, yen, or something else, crypto even. All it takes is a few major countries to decide to make a switch, and more countries will follow. So if this was to occur, what would happen? What would the result be of the US dollar no longer having this important distinction of being the reserve currency? The US would be forced to pay off its debtors. As of making this video, the United States is over $30 trillion in government debt. In fact, to understand this, let's look at this graph. As time goes on, the amount of money that the government has in debt increases. This number is actually growing so rapidly that there's a website dedicated to showing how much the United States is in debt. The United States government in this situation would have to pay off its debt, like I said before. However, this is nearly an impossible task to do because the debt has gotten so high. If the government decided to print more money to pay off the debt, it would only cause further hyperinflation. The dollar could potentially fall to the value of a penny today. Now, if everything was to play out in this way, and the situation played out and the United States was in extreme hyperinflation, the only really real cause that we could significantly point to and say this was the main reason it happened, if this didn't happen, then we wouldn't have been in this situation, is that cutting the United States dollar from the gold standard has to be that explanation. If we were still on the gold standard, we wouldn't see all this national debt because we'd be tied to gold, so we wouldn't be able to print off this money or even take out these loans. We allowed for this possibility of hyperinflation, and by possibility, it's probably not really a possibility very much anymore. It's probably just a matter of time before this actually does come true. I wonder how long it will take before our kids, grandkids, sons, daughters, relatives, cousins will be playing with heaps of money instead of wooden blocks. I just thought we needed to talk about this. I am Stephen Ethan, and I will probably see you in the next one.